All right, hello. This is my name is Mario Eafrati, and this is my PowerPoint assignment. I've been doing the last few papers and everything, and all the research on sustainable aviation fuel. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So for our introduction, we're going to cover a few questions over the course of our time together today. We're going to cover what is sustainable aviation fuel? Why is it important for aviation? And why is getting all the airlines and the entire aviation community on board so challenging? Why is it so challenging to get the aviation community away from traditional jet fuels? Is what we're going to be looking at today. So our first question, what is sustainable aviation fuel? I believe go to go forward with this, we need to understand and have a basic knowledge of what sustainable aviation fuel is. So sustainable aviation fuel can be a biofuel or synthetic fuel that reduces carbon emissions as opposed to jet fuel. So that is basically what sustainable aviation fuel is. So also, in order to even qualify as a sustainable aviation fuel, what determines it's sustainable is it has to be at least 50% more efficient than its competitor. So this is where we talk about what things are sustainable aviation fuels. In terms of biofuels, things like plants, animals, tallows, waste oils, even cooking oil can be used as biofuel, that side of the house. The other side of the sustainable aviation fuel house is synthetic fuel. So that is basically just an alternative way of making jet fuel made by hydrogen and captured carbon. And finally, we'll take a look at what exactly are fossil fuels, and why are they so bad? Why is there now competition and controversy over fossil fuels being used in the aviation industry? So fossil fuels, by definition, are just basically made from decomposing plants and animals, and they contain carbon and hydrogen that can be burned for energy. And those things combine over millions of years to form things like coal and things that we can burn for energy to not only power jets but to also power our houses and our cars as well. Aviation's environmental impact. So another thing we have to kind of understand why we're trying to use sustainable aviation fuel is how big of an impact does aviation really have on our climate. And studies show that aviation contributes to about 2, maybe even 3% of global emissions. One of the biggest reasons this is because jet fuel contains fossil fuels, and over the last few years, like I said, we've heard so much about the fossil fuel debate and what's happening there, and if there's a different way that we can go about things with fossil fuels. So another thing about aviation is, obviously, over the last few years since COVID, travel has skyrocketed again. And before COVID, it was on a trend to just continue to grow as well. And we're back on that track. Aviation is expected to just continue to increase. Air travel, I should say, is suspected to only increase as time goes on and potentially even double by the year 2050. And with that, with more flights and more things that are happening, you'll have more emissions concerns also, obviously, with fossil fuels and stuff like that. So this is where sustainable aviation fuel comes in. If there's going to be X amount of more travel in the future, how much can sustainable aviation fuel do to help? And that leads us into our next slide. How effective will sustainable aviation fuel be? Studies predict that it could produce up to an 80% reduction in carbon emissions. So it's obviously a very, very large number, and something to be excited about for that. Obviously, things that come with that: better air quality, better quality of life for people on the ground, potentially better noise pollution as well. And also, one of the things it does is it gives an alternative to fossil fuels. It gives competition to fossil fuels And when you're at the pump, so to speak, and your dispatcher calls and says, you got to take 10,000 pounds of gas. Well, who's going to be the one to come do it? Is it going to be Menzies bringing you your Jet A like usual, or is it going to be some unknown company that's yet to come around yet that is doing sustainable aviation fuel? Now, obviously, the biggest factor there is going to be price. We'll get into that in a little bit. But I guess my point there in bringing that up is it brings competition to a pretty one-sided field. Another thing that will help with sustainable aviation fuel is the fact that it can be produced from landfill waste. We'll be able to use landfill waste as not just waste. Great. There we go. Okay, sustainable aviation fuel and the environment. Sustainable aviation fuel is going to be a major tool, a major player in the aviation industry as time goes on. If things keep going the way that they're going, everybody, all the airlines these days are more focused on green operations and being cost effective and cost efficient with things like fuel. So one of the things that one of the largest engine manufacturers in the world, Pratt & Whitney, have done is come out with a new type of engine, such as the PW1000G, which is the Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan engine. So sustainable aviation fuel could potentially power those. It could potentially power all the ground equipment at the airport, things like pushback tugs and baggage carts, and all the things that run on diesel fuel could also maybe potentially be powered by sustainable aviation fuel. APUs, auxiliary power units, obviously run off the same type of Jet A fuel that the engines burn, so they would be running off of sustainable aviation fuel. So, if you think about it, you could really have a whole airport running off of sustainable aviation fuel, which would do wonders for the climate. Looking more at the Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan engine, the Pratt & Whitney 1000G, as we have covered already. It's a new type of engine family, and the biggest difference in these as opposed to a traditional turbine engine is the internal operation. So typically you have the internal workings of the turbine on the same crankshaft. The Pratt & Whitney geared turbofans actually have a gearbox allowing each internal section to operate on its own, or at its own optimal speed. This results in about a 16% reduction in, or a 16% increase in fuel efficiency, and about 75% increase, or 75% less noise. So now, how this ties into the sustainable aviation fuel conversation is, imagine, I'm sure with Pratt & Whitney, as big of a company as it is, they have people already testing the effects of using sustainable aviation fuel in place of Jet A inside of these brand new engines, or new engines that are to come down the line after this. And then you'll really start to see, I mean, that number could jump up to 50, 60, 70% fuel reduction, fuel efficiency, and hopefully maybe even more of a noise reduction as well. So with all these benefits, with how great sustainable aviation fuel seems, why isn't it being used more? Currently, only about 0.1% of the aviation industry is using sustainable aviation fuel. And why is that? Well, Scott Kirby, the CEO for United, has a pretty good take on this. He says there's no sustainable aviation jet fuel that is cost competitive to Jet A. So again, we talked about finances earlier, and that's going to be the driving cost pretty much for anything that any large company does, but especially in the aviation industry. You see ticket prices, bag prices, fuel prices, everything fluctuates. And when you have something that costs about 2 to 5 times more to produce than its competitor, I don't think any airline right now is going to be jumping to be first in line to switch their entire fleet with that kind of a bill. And then also scarcity of product, and just the fact that there isn't a large scale production company that can make sustainable aviation fuel. And one of the reasons this is because it actually would give competition to farmers, because they grow all these, let's take corn for example. They grow hundreds of acres of corn for consumption to sell to grocery stores and stuff like that. Well, now a sustainable aviation fuel company is going to come along and say, okay, we want to grow hundreds, if not thousands of acres of corn to make just for aviation fuel. Well, now that's thousands of acres that are being taken up for this new product that isn't even really tested yet. So nobody's really jumping, raising their hand for that. So what's being done to make this, to make sustainable aviation fuel happen in the future? Well, large airlines like United and Delta and British Airways and American and even governments and the Air Force and all that stuff, they are investing in these smaller companies that are producing or experimenting with sustainable aviation fuel. So they have to be backed somehow, and the big boys, the big airlines, are able to kind of fork over some cash and help those guys out. Obviously, government incentives, we kind of talked about that, incentives for producing sustainable aviation fuel and government contracts and things like that. And also airlines committing to using a certain percentage of sustainable aviation fuel. That number is arbitrary, 2030, but maybe it's 2050 or 2100, whatever. A lot of airlines are saying we want to be 10% reliant on sustainable aviation fuel by 2030 or 20%, or you get the idea. So that is what's being done. To wrap things up, sustainable aviation fuel is a huge part of reducing the carbon footprint of the aviation community and of the aviation industry. Obviously, the environmental benefits are there, with up to 80% reduction in fuel pollution, but with that are cost and production challenges that, in my opinion, reign supreme, because you don't see companies that are you're not going to see a company that wants to switch to something that isn't really even proven all that well yet. We can't make at a large scale and is going to cost 5 times more to a large corporation. It just doesn't make sense. And then again, kind of my take on things is that global efforts will need to continue to happen in order to make sustainable aviation fuel a realistic option in the future. Right now, there is a lot of help from, like I said, the big airlines and the government, stuff like that, but things need to change in order for that to happen. You need to see, like I said, more growth of crops and things like that, or figure out how to use just a section of waste from a landfill or something like that in order for that to happen. So that is about it. Here's the sources and everything, and that is my presentation on sustainable aviation fuel.